Hello and welcome to my third and final video in my mini-series all about knitting stripes. In this video I'm going to cover how to add in a third colour and start knitting 3 different colours of stripe. I'm going to be demonstrating how to carry yarn up the side of the knitting when knitting with 3 different colours, and I'm also going to demonstrate a few different ways of anchoring the carried yarn to the side of the knitting. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is add in the third colour, which is grey. I'm going to add it in using the method that I showed in the previous videos. So I'm just going to make a loop with the end of the grey yarn, with the tail end away from me. I'm going to take my right hand needle up through the top stitch, drop the loop over the right hand needle point, and complete the first knit stitch to incorporate that yarn. I'm now going to weave the grey yarn tail into the back of my knitting as I knit along this row. This is a technique I showed in my previous video, and you simply hold the grey yarn tail in your left hand and go into the next stitch as usual. Then bring the tail around the needles to the front. Wrap the working yarn around the right hand needle as usual. Take the yarn tail around the needles to the back again, and then complete the knit stitch. And then do a normal knit stitch, and then do a knit stitch where you weave the yarn tail into the stitch. And then you repeat these 2 stitches at least 3 or 4 times, and then knit to the end of the row. I then knit another row to bring me back to the side where I first added this new yarn. Now all 3 working yarns are on the right hand side, as you can see here. I now want to change to using the cream coloured yarn. There are a couple of ways to do this, and I'm going to demonstrate both. You can take the cream yarn over the other 2 yarns and just start knitting with it. Or, as I'm going to show first, you can weave the cream yarn between the other 2 yarns instead. And to do that, you take the cream yarn under the brown yarn, which is the yarn above it, and then over and in front of the grey yarn, which is the yarn at the top. And then you start knitting with that cream yarn. So I'm just going to knit 2 rows in the cream colour now to bring me back to the same side. Okay, so now we have the cream yarn at the top, then the grey and then the brown. You can tighten these yarns up a little, but make sure that the sides don't bunch up, and make sure you can still stretch the edge to make sure it's loose enough. Now I want to switch to the brown yarn. So I notice that the brown yarn is coming out of the front of the knitting. So it's going to go behind the yarn above it. So you're going to take the brown yarn behind the grey, and then over and in front of the cream yarn. And then you just use the brown yarn to knit 2 more rows. And now we have the brown working yarn at the top, then the cream yarn, and then the grey yarn. The grey comes out of the front of the knitting and the cream comes out of the back because of the way it's been woven. I then do a quick tighten up of the yarns. And now I'm going to do the more usual or common method of changing yarn colour between stripes. So instead of weaving one yarn between the others, I'm now just going to take the chosen yarn in front of the other 2 yarns. So here I want to change to the grey colour, so I simply take the grey yarn, take it over and in front of the cream and brown yarns, and just start knitting with it. And then I just knit 2 rows as usual to bring me back to the same side. And now what we have is the grey yarn at the top, then the brown, then the cream. And you can start to see some neat stripes forming in your knitting. Now I'm going to switch to cream using the same method again. So I simply pick up the cream yarn and take it over the other 2 yarns and just start knitting with it. And I again knit back and forth along the row. Because of the twisting of yarns that occurs when you're knitting stripes, it might be necessary to periodically untwist the balls of yarn just to make sure that the yarns don't all twist up into a bit of a mess. So just bear that in mind when you're knitting stripes. And now you can see what those stripes look like so far on both sides. If we look at the side of the knitting, we can compare how the 2 methods look. There isn't a lot of difference, to be honest, but I think weaving the yarns makes it a bit more visible from the front, although it does seem to have slightly shorter strands of yarn on display. When I'm knitting stripes, I just stick with the most common method. So what happens now if I want to carry on knitting with the cream yarn to make a wider stripe? Well, in this scenario, because the brown and grey yarns are not going to be used for at least a couple more rows, and therefore they're going to be carried up the side of the knitting, they will need to be anchored to the side of the knitting using the cream yarn. Any carried yarns need to be anchored to the knitting at regular intervals. Now there are a few different ways of doing this, and I'm going to demonstrate 3 of them today. The first method I'm going to show you involves weaving the carried yarns into the back of the knitting for 1 stitch only. So we're going to use exactly the same technique as I showed earlier, where I wove the yarn tails into the back of the knitting whilst I knit along a row, but we're only going to do that for 1 single stitch. So what I do is I take the unused or the carried yarns, i.e. the grey and the brown, behind the needles and hold them in my left hand. I then take my right hand needle and go into the top stitch, then bring the yarns around the needles to the front, wrap the cream working yarn as normal around the right hand needle point, and then take the other working yarns back around the needles to the back, before completing the knit stitch. Then you simply drop the carried yarns and carry on knitting with the cream yarn only. So I complete the row with the cream yarn and then knit a further row to get me back to where I started. If we look at the back now, you can see those 2 yarns being carried up the side of the knitting, and they are anchored by 2 strands of cream yarn. This method hides the yarns by bringing them more towards the back of the knitting, and the fact there are 2 strands of cream yarn around those carried yarns helps to disguise and hide those yarns even better. For the next method, I'm going to use the most common method, which is where you simply twist all the yarns together at regular intervals. So I like to anchor the carried yarns every couple of rows, just to keep them nice and neat at the side of my knitting. So this time all I do is wrap the carried yarns around the cream yarn in 1 full circle. So I take the grey and brown yarns over and in front of the cream yarn, and then I take the cream yarn over and in front of the grey and brown yarns, and I then knit another 2 rows with the cream yarn. Note that I always do an even number of rows because I need to get back to the right hand side of the knitting where all of the carried yarns are. Now if we look at the back of the knitting, we can see that the 2 yarns are still being carried up the side of the knitting as before. So using this second method, which is the most common method, the yarns are anchored by a single strand of cream yarn. And that's really the only difference. Both of the methods I've shown so far are quite neat and compact and carry the yarns in the same position on the side of the knitting. The only difference is the number of strands of yarn that anchor those carried yarns. So it's really personal preference which method you prefer, but both of them do a good job. The next and final method I'm going to show you involves wrapping the carried yarns around the first stitch. To do this, hold the carried yarns, i.e. the brown and grey yarns, in your left hand behind the needles. Then slip the top stitch knitwise. So you take your right hand needle up through the top stitch as if to knit, and then just slip that stitch onto the right hand needle. You then bring the carried yarns to the front, between the needles, and then you slip this stitch back onto your left hand needle, purlwise. You then drop the carried yarns to the front of your knitting, and then just knit with the cream yarn as you normally would, making sure that you take the cream yarn over and in front of the carried yarns before you do so. And then I just knit 2 more rows with that cream yarn. I then repeat that same method again so I can show you clearly what it looks like on the back. If we then take a look at the front and the back of the knitting, you can see that this third method produces a lot more bulk on both the front and the back than the previous methods. So I would personally pick one of the first 2 methods to use in your knitting. I just wanted to show you a few different examples so you could compare and pick your favourite. Otherwise, it's difficult to tell which method works best and what the result looks like. Note that the grey and the brown yarns are at the same level, i.e. they're leaving the knitting at exactly the same place, whilst the cream yarn is currently at the top. If you now wanted to switch to knitting with either the grey or the brown yarn, you just use the method that I showed earlier, where you take the chosen yarn over and in front of the other 2, and then just start knitting. You would then knit a couple of rows in that colour. You would then need to decide whether you're going to carry on knitting with the same colour, and therefore you'll need to choose your favourite method of anchoring the carried yarns to the side of your knitting, or you can then switch colours again by simply picking up the new colour and taking it over and in front of the other yarns, and then start knitting with it. And so on and so forth for the rest of your knitting project. I hope this mini series all about knitting stripes has been helpful to you, and thank you very much for watching.